when I had been saved just a few months, I was asked to speak at a ladies' night banquet down in Sarasota. They had a new CBMC down there, and they had a ladies' night banquet, and went down there. There were only 6 or 8 couples, something like that, at the banquet. And I gave my testimony, and I had never tried to give an invitation, anything like that before, but I did. And one fellow raised his hand. And so afterwards, I told him I'd like to talk to him, and I got him aside and told him what I did to ask the Lord to come in my heart, and he prayed the sinner's prayer with me. Well, you know, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I got a letter from that fellow, and he really went on with the Lord. He's in full-time work with Child Evangelism Fellowship. He handles their area up in Gainesville area, and his name is David Hughes, and he's organizing a youth camp up there and everything. But you know, there have been years and years since I heard from him, and it's just such a pleasure to hear years later how these people that when the Lord used you, you know, in bringing them to Him, to hear years later how they're coming along. And then last night we sat across the table from Thelma. This girl, Thelma, her name was Thelma Townsend, and now it's Thelma Anthony. And we sat across the table from her, and it was such a thrill. All the people she'd ask about. Now, she hadn't seen or heard from any of these. She didn't know that Donald was married or Gary was married, or she didn't know that Joe was married, you know, and she didn't know what they were doing or anything. And it was just a real thrill to be able to, nearly everybody she'd ask about, why, he's in charge of Word of Life in Argentina now. What? You know, well, he was just a mean old brat when I knew him. And so it's just a thrill, you know, seeing how the Lord works in lives. By the way, I got a letter yesterday from Joe and Melva, and things are going great. They've had one person, one outfit off from a camp all ready to go down there, if they can just work out some sort of details. But they say things are just going so fast they just can't even imagine it, how the Lord's working with them so fast. By the way, they want somebody to send them some tapes.
They asked. They wrote an ask. And
I'll send them some.
You have their mailing address in Argentina?
Yeah.
Well, they'd like to have some. Then I got a letter from, of course, most of you some of you are on Gary's prayer letter, and you got a prayer letter from him just this last week or so, and I got a personal letter from him too, and he seems to be just where the Lord wants him. He just seems, he couldn't be putting on how pleased he is with how the Lord's using him there. And I don't know if that's the Lord's favorite place for Gary or not. It seems like he got there by a very roundabout, strange way, but you see, when your heart is just right and you want to serve the Lord, he just uses you anyhow. And so this is why I didn't have any problems in my mind recommending some of you to be a part of the ministry of kids like Gary and Joe, because I've seen them come through. You know, I remember Gary one time, he was on the high school baseball team, and he loved baseball. And along came the Bible Club program, and the Bible Club and the baseball games were the same night, and he had to make a choice. And he chose the Bible Club. And it was the biggest thing that ever happened to him as far as spiritual growth, because he gave up something he really liked, and the Lord really honored it. And I could really see the growth in Gary from that time on. Well, it's good to talk about these things, but anyway. We're in Daniel, the 5th chapter. And maybe we ought to have a little word of review. Now, obviously, these stories that we have recorded in Daniel are literally true. This is what happened. God is recording something. But you always have to remember that He had a reason for recording these things in the Bible in lieu of many other things that were true. And He could have recorded, but He didn't. And He could have recorded them in a different way. For instance, any of these stories, you have only part of the details, don't you? you have some things are very detailed, like telling exactly how that image was made, and so forth. But God tells these things, and He tells them in such a way to present additional spiritual truths, depending upon how far you want to dig into what He says. And so when we read these things, like we find in Daniel, it's easy to see the surface truth of the three young men that were so steadfast that they were willing to be thrown into the fiery furnace rather than to worship a false god. And surely this is a fine scripture to present that type of a lesson. But there are other truths there, see, and the language tells you that there are other truths. And so that's why we can know that when we read about this great statue in the 2nd chapter of Daniel, that there are several different applications. Now, in the text, you're given the details of one application. That is, it tells the course of human history during what is known as the times of the Gentiles in the Bible. And it speaks of 4 great world empires. It says the first one is headed by Nebuchadnezzar, and he's represented by that head of gold. Then it said the next one is represented by the chest and arms, and we find out that that's the kingdom that succeeded Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom of Babylon. And it was in 2 parts. It was the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. Media was directly north of Babylon. And then Persia was more over to the east. But these nations, in conjunction with one another, formed an alliance and became the world power. And they were represented by silver. Then we found that the next, the loins and thighs and so forth, where the strength of the body is, they were represented by brass. And we're told that this was the kingdom of Alexander the Great, or Greece. We're going to see this again. It's going to be portrayed for us in another way. And then the legs were of iron and clay mingled together. And they went on down into feet. And when they were legs, they stood for the Roman Empire, as it was when the time of Christ was here. And then the Roman Empire evolved into a profusion of nations, some weak and some strong, and they don't mix together. We're always trying to mix them together with the League of Nations or the United Nations and all that, but they don't mix, just like clay and iron doesn't mix. And this situation is going to continue until the Lord comes, as represented by the smiting stone. And we saw in this picture not only the course of the Gentile nations, but we saw a picture of how God views man's abilities to rule himself. God sees it as a great statue that had the right thought, that is to say, God gave man dominion. It was a divine purpose originally, as represented by the gold. But he's not doing the right things with his hands, and he's not walking the right places. And his feet won't hold him. And God sees man in his walk through this world this way. But man sees himself as in the picture, as we see pictured in Nebuchadnezzar's statue. In the 3rd chapter, all of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide. And man sees himself as quite a thing, you know, and a thing of glory. But God doesn't see man that way. Then in the 4th chapter, we saw the way man looked at his culture, what man thinks of his educational and social structure, or particularly as we see it manifested in education and progress, or that's industrial and what we call civilization, man sees as this great tree that gives shelter to all the world. But God says it's going to have to be cut down. The heavenly watcher is looking at it. The time's going to come when it's going to have to be cut down. And Nebuchadnezzar, representing man, is going to be like an animal for 7 years. But God's not going to utterly destroy human society, because it says that he leaves the stump there, bound by a band of iron and a band of brass. So God's going to bring the human society back, just like he brought Nebuchadnezzar back and revived him and became a human being again. And then he acknowledged that God was God. And the end result we find in the last verse of the 4th chapter, where Nebuchadnezzar says, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his ways judgment or justice, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase." Now, Nebuchadnezzar came to this conclusion. Took a lot to bring him to that conclusion. And it takes a lot to bring some of us to that conclusion. Some of us must reach the absolute depths of despair. We must go to the bottom of the barrel, either financially or emotionally or physically, or in some way God has to take us down and down and down, just like he took Nebuchadnezzar down, until we acknowledge that God is God and his words are true. And then when we turn to him, he sets us aright again. And then we go around saying, like Nebuchadnezzar said, I praise and extol and honor the King. Well, then what do we have here in the 5th chapter? We have the story of a man named Belshazzar. Now, this is almost like the name that Daniel was called. See, the name Daniel means God is judge. Some say it means that. Some say it means God's judge. But the two words God and judge, Dan means judge. E-L means God. So you can put it together like you want to. It means either it means that Daniel is God's judge, or it means the parents of Daniel, or one being godly, just wanted to acknowledge God is judge. The name Dan means judge. And we find this, we don't have to guess about that, because we're told that back in Genesis when Jacob's son Dan was named Dan. He said he named him Dan because he would judge his people. And E-L is one of the names of God. So Daniel means God's judge, or God is judge. I don't know which one of those is right, but you have the two aspects of it. And when these young men were taken in captivity in Babylon, the Babylonians changed their names. And Belteshazzar means prince of Baal. Baal was the god of the Babylonians. So they say, well, we don't want you to be named God is judge. We want you to be named prince of Baal. And this name here, Belshazzar, has the same root as Belteshazzar. Notice back over in the 1st chapter of Daniel. You see, look at Daniel 1:6. Now among these, or these young men that were taken in captivity, were the children of Judah. Daniel, God is judge. Hananiah, God is gracious. Mishael, who is as God, that means God is so great, who could be like him? And Azariah, God is my help. All of these young men had godly parents that named them in some way. Well, when they went over there to Babylon, they didn't like that. So they said, you need Babylonian names. So they named Daniel Belteshazzar, which meant prince of Baal, which is their god. And they changed, see down in the next 7th verse, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, and he gave unto Daniel the name Belteshazzar. Now, if you've got a New Schofield Bible, you look over there in the margin, H, and it'll say, that Belteshazzar is identical in meaning with Belshazzar. See that? So I didn't make it up out of my head. Somebody else thought the same thing. Anyway, and then Hananiah, he changed to Shadrach. And that means illumined by the sun god. See, they worship the sun god too. And Mishael, they changed his name to Meshach. And that means illumined by the moon god. In other words, one, they said, you've been shined upon by the sun god, and the other one, you've been shined upon by the moon god. And Azariah, they call Abednego. And this means a servant of another god, Negi, or Nego, which, but what they did, you see, they all had names which had something to do with the true God. And they turned them around and gave them names that had to do with the false gods. And I don't know, when they wrote the song, I don't know why they say Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They ought to say Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, hadn't they? I guess that doesn't fit the music as well, huh? But anyway, when you call them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, well, you're calling them by their heathen names. Well, this is a picture too, you see. God has a purpose for us. And the purpose that he has for us is like these boys were named. Hananiah, part of our job in this world is to show how gracious God is. That's one of the best things that a Christian can be occupied with. Showing forth how gracious God is. Somebody was asking me recently what I thought of a particular organization system of evangelization, you know. And I said, well, God uses it. It's not my idea of how God would have us to do it, but God's very gracious. And when he sees that we want to be involved in what he's doing, if we haven't got the inclination to seek out his mind so that we know how he does things, and we get involved anyway, well, he's gracious. He was gracious to Martha as well as Mary. Although Mary, he said, had chosen the better part. He's a gracious God. And sometimes you'll see Christians involved in a great activity. And it'll look like it's setting the world on fire, you know. And you can see people get saved through it. And you can hear people testify that they got saved through this system. That doesn't mean necessarily that that's God's way of doing something. It doesn't mean that it fits into the Scripture. What it means is God is gracious. That's what it means. So part of what we ought to be doing is showing forth that God is gracious. And then Mishael, or Meshach, as the Babylonians call him, we ought to be showing forth that we believe God is really, who is as God. That's what we ought to be proclaiming and showing forth. Who is as our God? And then Azariah, God is my help. Let people know. So you see, there's a lesson here, even in these names. But what I wanted to show you was, for the purpose of our lesson tonight, that Daniel was given the same name that our chief character has in this story tonight. So we're going to be talking about Belshazzar. Now in this story, it's going to call Nebuchadnezzar his father. Actually, Nebuchadnezzar was probably his grandfather. Now, you can't go by when in the Bible it calls somebody else's son. It might mean their son down the line. For instance, Christ is called the son of David. He's also called the son of Abraham. And David's called the son of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it means that he's a lineal descendant. Doesn't necessarily mean he was the next lineal descendant. And when somebody's called somebody else's father, it doesn't mean he was immediately fathered him. He means that he fathered him up the line somewhere. And it could have been 1 generation, 2 generations, or 15 generations previously, and it still calls him the father. So if you realize that in the Bible, you won't get mixed up. Now, how do we know that Belshazzar is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar? Well, Jeremiah told us. And if you want to know, or so somebody can tell you, look at, hold your place in Daniel and go backwards in your Bible to Jeremiah, a couple of 3 books, 27th chapter. And Jeremiah was prophesying. In Jeremiah chapter 27, he was prophesying to the children of Israel just before they were taken captivity by Nebuchadnezzar. And he says in Jeremiah 27:6, "Now have I given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and the beasts of the field have I given him also to serve him, and all nations shall serve him, and his son and his son's son, until the very time of his land come." Now this phrase, the time of his land come, it means when time's up, when the time comes, it's consummation. "And then many nations and great kings shall serve themselves of him," or enslave him. In other words, it says that Nebuchadnezzar, the one that's going to take the children of Israel into captivity, is going to have a kingdom. And that kingdom is going to survive through his son and his son's son. And at the time of his son's son, it's going to be destroyed. That's going to be the end of it. Its time is going to come, and then it's going to be enslaved, or served of someone else. Now this is exactly what happened. While Belshazzar was in charge, well, that's when the Medo-Persians came. We'll read about that. So let's go back to Daniel, the 5th chapter. "Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the 1,000. Sometimes when you see the word 1,000, it doesn't mean literally 1,000. Just like the word 10 doesn't mean literally 10. It means enough for the purposes. And 1,000 is 10 emphasized. In other words, it's 10 to the 3rd power. 1,000 is 10 times 10, 10 times 10 times 10. So this may have meant there was 1,000, or it may have meant that there were thousands and thousands. It may meant literally 1,000. I doubt it. It was probably a lot more than that. But anyway, he made a feast to 1,000 of his lords, drank wine before the 1,000. Now, when this term drinking wine is used figuratively, now they literally drank wine. I mean, this story, now keep in mind, all the time we're trying to find the figurative meaning. This all happened literally just exactly like it's recorded. Or God would have told us it was a parable. It's not a parable, it's an actual historical fact. But to drink wine, figuratively means, is to do whatever you need to do to have your enjoyments, get your kicks. In other words, he was getting his kicks. He was living it up.
They must have gotten pretty drunk when they praised the gods of gold, silver, brass, and iron, and wood, and stone.
He was probably pretty drunk, but they didn't have to get very drunk to do that. They were doing that. They did that even when they were sober. That's what man does today. Man doesn't have to get drunk today, Brother Payne, to worship things like that. Some people worship money. Some people worship position. Some people worship styles. You know, it's the same thing. Just we have a little more to worship nowadays, but you might show forth your worship more, but you can worship them without being drunk. But anyway, they drank wine before and Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, in other words, while he was really living it up, he did something else. He commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes and his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Now, this is a picture of how, when man does everything else to get his kicks, and he gets tired of trying to get kicks through drunkenness and revelry and sex and whatever else, then he gets on a religious binge, and he perverts religion. That's what he does for kicks. He perverts religion. I heard one day a fellow objecting to the fact that somebody else thought that Jesus Christ was any more than any other historical figure. And in his objection, he cursed and used the name of Christ in vain, just out of habit, repeatedly. And the other person says, have you ever heard anybody curse in the name of Alexander the Great? Or have you ever heard anybody curse in the name of any other great historical figure? No. You curse in the name of Christ. You use his name in vain when you want to curse. That ought to show somebody that there's some evil power behind such things, hadn't it? And the devil doesn't have any reason to have you curse in the name of Alexander the Great or George Washington or anybody else like that. Did you ever think about that? That this fits into the category of the psalmist that said that God shall even make the wrath of man to praise him. And in a very perverted way, man is recognizing the divinity and the greatness of Jesus Christ when they curse with his name, because they wouldn't curse with his name if he wasn't God. Sometimes when you hear somebody take the Lord's name in vain, you might, just in a quiet way, bring that to their attention. Just say, hey, so just a minute, I noticed that you said a curse word then, and you took the name of Christ in vain. You ever wondered why you never used some other great man's name to curse with? I never have heard anybody. Have you ever heard anybody say an oath with Abraham Lincoln?
By George.
Well, now, that's a case in point. People don't consider that cursing, do they? No, that's, in fact, is in most good cursing societies, that would be pretty namby-pamby. Just to say, by George.
But you know it lets off the steam just as good. By George.
Huh?
He said it don't quite let the steam off right.
Doesn't seem to for some people. But anyway, you see, this is how it shows how man is. He's not willing just to be in his own moral debauchery, but he's got to bring God into his immorality. That's what that's what Belshazzar was doing. He says that I am going to so brazenly show what I think of God that I'm going to take his things and do my sin with them. And of course, this is the most brazen type of rebellion against God. And this is what we see around us today. We see man not willing to bring himself to utter degradation morally, but he brings God into his degradation. As a matter of fact, many of your false religions, particularly back during this time and a little later on, the Greek society and so forth, your religion involved your basest immoralities. Whatever was the most despicable moral sin you could think of, that's how they perform their religious activity, their worship. And this is, of course, satanic. All false worship is satanic. But it shows you what man will do. Now here's Belshazzar, and here you see we can't use Nebuchadnezzar anymore to represent man because we got him saved. So we have to use somebody else, don't we? And so we're using Belshazzar. And God is showing us by this story of Belshazzar what he thinks of man's social structure. Now, you don't have to look far to see that we do the same thing today. The more immoral a famous person is, the more they become idolized. Why? All this business about Ted Kennedy, that didn't hurt him a bit. See, this made him more of a hero. All you have to do, if people want to make you famous, they'll worship you more or idolize you more the more immoral you are. You take movie stars like Errol Flynn, for instance. I mention him because I was once in his home when I was in a pilot. I was a pilot in a squadron. In this squadron, I was a replacement pilot, and they had just been over and bombed the inland sea in Japan. And a couple of them got killed, a couple of pilots in the battle, and I was one of the replacements for one of the guys that got killed. And the commander of our squadron was a personal friend of Errol Flynn's, and Errol Flynn said that he wanted to have him and his whole squadron up to his house for a party. And I wasn't saved then, but I must have been innocent compared to some of those, because now Errol Flynn lived up there in this beautiful home on Mulholland Drive, 3,000 feet above sea level. You looked out the front door and you saw all the lights of the San Fernando Valley, looked out the back door and you saw all the lights of Los Angeles. A beautiful place up there. And the house was, one side was a mirror of the other side. It had two parts exactly alike. And he and his concubine, or whatever you want to call her, lived on one side, and his double, who looked just about like him, and his lived on the other. And Errol Flynn's wife lived down in Hollywood. And that just was the way to do it. I mean, he was married, and he took his wife out to particular places and so forth, and I forgot what that one's name was, but anyway, he had, but he didn't live with her. He lived for a while with whichever one he wanted to live. Now, imagine, now they had all kind of drinks and stuff and served like that, but imagine my surprise when everybody started taking off their clothes and jumping in the swimming pool right in front of everybody else, you know. And that was when I bundled up my little bride and left. But the party just, and some of the fellows were telling me about it, and they said, well, boy, you really left when the party started. But this is just one. Now, I was at this firsthand, so I know what I'm talking about. I saw him jump in the swimming pool naked. The girl that he was living with, the little starlet or whatever she was, she started to pray. And I saw her just bare naked, just go and jump in, and then everybody started jumping. And as I say, that's when I bundled up my little gal and took her home. But they had them a party. See, yet those were the heroes at that time. Errol Flynn was one of the biggest heroes on the stage, and girls all over the place going gaga. Well, the man that manages the Beatles says that they're the most blasphemous, immoral people in the world. And yet, see, we idolize that type of thing. And the worse they are, the more we idolize them. Same thing happened here. See, it hasn't changed. Well, God thinks the same thing about that type of social life and everything that emanates from it, that he thought about this. This is going to tell us what God thinks about such as this. Now, Belshazzar here is representing man's idea of how to really live it up. To have this great big ball. Bring your wives and girlfriends and what have you, and get them all drunk enough to really don't care what goes on. Everybody has fun, see. That's what they were doing here. Second verse again. Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes and his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes and his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, and brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. In other words, they used holy things in their worship, and this is what they call worship. See, when they got right at the top of their trip, I guess you'd call it, then they were worshiping. This is what God thinks of man's idea of worship. 5th verse, in the same hour came forth the fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick or lampstand upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. You know, usually when you see this portrayed in the picture, you see a hand writing. Well, it wasn't a hand, it was just the fingers. What it says here, it says, saw the fingers of a man's hand. Then it says, the part of the hand that wrote, is what he saw. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against the other. He was scared, wasn't he? Wasn't it back in Jeremiah? Isn't that what he said was going to happen? Back there, did we read that? He said there's one is someplace there. One of those prophets said that was going to happen. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers and the Chaldeans and the soothsayers. That's the same crowd that his granddaddy tried to get wisdom from. And the king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and show me its interpretation shall be clothed with scarlet, have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known unto the king the interpretation of it. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonied or perplexed. Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house, and the queen spoke and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. There's a man in thy kingdom, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. She didn't have a better sense than to think there were many gods either. And in the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar thy father, the king, I say, thy father made him master of the magicians and the astrologers and the Chaldeans and the soothsayers, forasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams, and showing of hard sentences and dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. Then was Daniel brought in before the king, and the king spoke and said unto Daniel, Art thou that Daniel, who art the child of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in thee. And now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, and they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation of it, but they could not show the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of thee, that thou canst make interpretation. Have you ever noticed that when somebody really gets into trouble, they know to call God's man? They know. They watch, see. They hear. They've heard of you, see. When it gets down, they know who to call. 16th verse, And I have heard of thee, that thou canst make interpretations and dissolves doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing, and make known to me the interpretation of it, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and thou shalt be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered and said unto thee, King, let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known to him the interpretation. O thou king, the most high God, gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor, and for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would he slew, and whom he would he kept alive, and whom he would he set up, and whom he would he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him, and he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beast, and his dwelling was with wild asses, and he fed with them grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointed over it whomsoever he will. And thou, his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all of this. You see, old Nebuchadnezzar, he was a faithful witness. He told him, listen, you better do right. This was his grandson. And Daniel says, look, who are you trying to fool? You know all about your grandfather Nebuchadnezzar and his testimony and what happened to him. And he told you that if you got proud, God would bring you low, and you got proud anyhow. Well, we see the same thing today. People don't heed that type of warning any more than Belshazzar did. He's got to learn himself. 23rd verse. But thou hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of the house before thee, and thou and thy lords and thy wives and thy concubines have drunk wine from them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold, and brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know, and the God in whose hands thy breath is, and whose all thy ways hast thou not glorified. You see, old Daniel's putting sin right where it is. That's man's chief sin anyway, that he won't glorify the God that he knows about. Man knows. He knows there's a God to be glorified. He can't hide it and cover it up with all his own ways and so forth. And see, what's happening here is God's showing the heart of man. God's faithful. And he lets man know. And all of these pious people that you meet that say, well, I don't know, I don't believe that God's going to send the poor heathen to hell, and I don't know, how about all the good Mohammedans? I had a person just the other day say, you mean to tell me that God is going to send a good, sincere, earnest Muslim to hell? Are you trying to tell me that? And I says, look, if a Muslim ever gets to be your next door neighbor, you better hope he's not a good one. Because a good Muslim that goes by his teachings sincerely believes everybody that won't accept Muslim ought to have his head chopped off. And that you're glorifying God when you do it. And you let a good Muslim child ever change from the Muslim faith, and that Muslim will have nothing to do with that child. Now that's entirely different from Christianity. A true Christian, now I'm not talking about a professing Christian, but a true Christian, when his child leaves the Christian faith, pities him and loves him the more and prays for him. But no false religion. I don't care, you name any false religion. If their child...
And this was the end of this tape.